Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experiencing enriching your most important relationships. During today's event, I'll be your host and moderator as we present Dealing with That Crazy Family Member. During family gatherings, do you silently whisper to yourself, if this certain family member comes to the event, I know exactly how the interactions will go? There'll be some nice things shared, opinions will move to hardline positions, and as the evening progresses, tensions will rise until there's yet another blow-up with feelings hurt all over again. It happens the same way every time that crazy person comes around. It's the same repetitive song, yet another verse. Its craziness always happens the same way, and it's really disastrous. Does this sound familiar to anyone in your family? Hopefully not, but it's quite common in families. For no family is exempt from challenging family members. However, it is important that we manage well these difficult interactions. God has called us into living peacefully with one another. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 instructs, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God, our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. During today's My Therapist Says, we will attempt to assist you in better handling these difficult family members. Following a brief presentation on the topic, most of the evening will be given to responding to your questions. We prayerfully hope you will leave this session with new ideas, enhanced skills, and practical relationship tool applications for managing that difficult family member. Dr. Dan Jenkins is our guest presenter. He is a licensed clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at Point Loma Nazarene University, and owner of Lighthouse and directs Lighthouse Psychological Services, a professional mental health center located in San Diego. Dan is a good friend and colleague and a regular My Therapist Says presenter and participant. He also happens to be a well-informed and articulate communicator. Today's event takes place before a live audience and live streaming, while offering practical biblical solutions. It's like having your own Christian mental health provider within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we now connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. And again, welcome to My Therapist Says, and I want to welcome our guest this evening, Dr. Dan Jenkins. He's a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. He's also a full professor at Point Loma Nazarene University, and he's going to be beginning actually a master's in marriage and family therapy that will lead to an MFT, Master's of a marriage and family therapist, as well as a licensed professional counselor in a regional office of Point Loma Nazarene University in Mission Valley. That's going to be beginning here in about a year, I believe. Is that correct? And he was chosen to lead that, certainly a very equipped person to do so. He also is the owner and director of what's called Lighthouse Psychological Services that serves the greater San Diego community. So if you're looking for a therapist, he has multiple sites as well as a number of psychotherapists that would be of help to you. Please see him following this evening, or we had information about his phone number that you could reach him as well. So we welcome Dr. Jenkins, and so glad you're here. And he is a strong family member. If you knew his children, his wife, and his grandchildren now, you would see that he has been foremost dedicated to his family, and that's obvious in the health of his family that are not here with us this evening. But I know you even were able to see a family member over the weekend. So anyway, welcome, Dr. Jenkins. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Jenkins?
Thank you very, very much. Let's try it this way. Thank you very, very much for that wonderful introduction, Don. I do consider Don one of my good friends, and now we work in the same set of offices, so we're neighbors too. Mm-hmm. Well, tonight's topic, what to do with that crazy family member. Let me see by a show of hands, how many of you have a crazy person in your family? Do you have? Oh, look at that. Quite a few. Now, one step further. How many of you have more than one? Anybody? Oh, look at all those hands. How many of you are the crazy person in your family? Okay, we got a few very willing people to admit to that. That's very good. What is crazy? In order to define that, we have to kind of take a step back and try to figure out what is normal. And in trying to answer that question, we run into some really challenging kinds of walls. What is normal? We can look at the bell curve, the normal curve, they call it, that looks like this, and then we can say that people who fall out there on the tail ends of that bell curve are different than the vast majority that fall in the center, and so those people must be a bit abnormal. We can look at things like, how dangerous are they? Are they in distress? Are they disturbed? Things like that might help us to determine whether they are normal or abnormal. But I think what we can settle on for sure is that we all have certain things about us that are relatively normal, and we probably all, at one time or another, act kind of crazy. Would you agree with me on that? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, since we all act a little bit crazy, I think I'm going to try to tease that idea apart and describe several different types of craziness. And then you get to decide what kind of craziness you might be and what kind of craziness your family member might be, because that will determine how you handle the situation, okay? I've broken it down into 3 major categories: the psychotic, the neurotic, and the personality disordered crazy, okay? Now let's start with the psychotic form of craziness. And rather ironically, my wife and I were called on Thursday by her brother. She has 2 brothers that live in Grand Junction, Colorado. Has anybody been to Grand Junction? Oh, look at that. A lot of you have. And those 2 brothers live there. They're both a bit on the crazy side. One, he grows the state plant, if you know what I'm talking about. The other one, he's in construction, but he did methamphetamines for years. He was a drug abuser. Now, the younger one, who was the drug abuser, is going through a crisis. He is experiencing delusions of persecution. And what I mean by that is that he has this unshakable belief that he is going to be arrested and thrown in jail and the key tossed away, and he's going to spend the rest of his life living in jail. Now, that may not be such an unusual idea, except for the fact he hasn't done anything wrong, okay? So you can see that, it's possible he could be innocently thrown in jail, but very unlikely. So he's living every day in torment, thinking that this is the day that he is going to be arrested and thrown in jail for no apparent reason. And he was really, really getting very distressed, to the point where he was anxious, having panic attacks, curled up on the floor in a ball. His older brother called us and said, "You've got to get out here." My wife is a therapist as well, so these kinds of responsibilities fall on our shoulders. And so we jumped on a plane and flew out there. And his reality is so different than yours and mine. He doesn't see things the same way. And so as a result of that, he was suffering from psychotic symptoms. Psychotic individuals often see things that aren't there, hallucinations, could be any of the five senses. And they sometimes have these unshakable beliefs that might be rather absurd at times. The first thing he said to us when we got to his house was, "I know you're going to put me in the hospital." And I asked him, how much do you believe that? And he said, 100%. And I went on to question him about a few things, and that was to see if he was a danger to himself or a danger to others, and he wasn't. And so we spent the weekend with him just trying to help him get some grounding, making sure that he had support, making sure that he took his medications properly, just trying to help him get a little bit firmer grasp on what reality is. My heart bled for this man. He is in so much personal turmoil, and it's by his own hand or by his own thoughts. And so that is the definition of a psychosis. It's a very, very serious form of mental illness. The second that I'd like to describe is what we call neurosis. And it has to do with your nerves. Traditionally, it has to do with anxiety. My dearest sister married that kind of crazy. I've got another story to tell you. This is family revelation time, okay? So this gentleman she married is unfortunately very insecure and very avoidant. And he once got his feelings really hurt by us when we had been kind of trading off babysitting. Years ago, when my kids were all very small, we would trade babysitting. And he was over at our house babysitting his kids and ours while we went out. We found out later that he had locked our kids outside and kept his kids inside, and that was the way it was for the entire evening. Now, that's not okay. So we confronted him on that in a gentle way. We know that he's kind of sensitive, but he really got upset and felt really, really bad. Instead of working it out with us, though, he decided that he didn't want to have anything to do with family. He came from a very bad family situation already. And so he decided that he wasn't going to do any more family functions as a result of that one little problem. And so in the last 20 years, I've seen him only one time, and that was when his daughter was getting married. He doesn't want to participate in anything. Even though my sister, she comes down every holiday and spends time with the family, he refuses. So we call this avoidant behavior, this high anxiety, high insecurity, a form of a neurosis. And people with a neurosis often feel very responsible for other people's feelings. They worry excessively about what other people might be thinking about them. Okay, so that is the essence of a neurosis. Now, people with a neurosis or a psychosis deserve our attention, okay? Generally speaking. I'm sure that sometimes it's manipulative, but most of the time, people who have those two things are suffering. And if you have a family member who falls into the definition of having a neurosis or a psychosis, I would say do your best to come to their aid. They are struggling. They are struggling with disorganized thinking, in the case of a psychosis, and they are just totally struggling with irrational thoughts when they have a neurosis, things that just don't seem to make sense. But there's a third kind of craziness I'd like to really address tonight. And some of you are aware of what this is. It's called character craziness. And we call it character because it has everything to do with your personality. And the newest manual that came out last year that talks a lot about mental disorders, the DSM-5, we call it, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, says that between 9 and 15% of the population in the United States has a personality disorder. Now, just think about that for a moment. Let's say it's 10%. 1 in 10 people. Now, think of how many people are in your family. What are the odds? They're kind of high, especially when you start adding up all the brothers and sisters and the aunts and the uncles and all the kids. Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that somebody just randomly might actually have a personality disorder. And the thing is, let me tell you a little bit about this. There are many, many ways that personalities can go wrong. Lots of different types of personality disorders, or what they used to call character disorders. I mean, we've got some that are antisocial and they don't have a really good moral compass. They don't have a sense of what's right and what's wrong. We have some that have borderline tendencies, and what we mean by that is that they kind of have a thin grasp on reality, and they tend to have very intense relationships that come and go very quickly, idealizing somebody and then thinking they're the devil the next. And this is such a brief description. But we have some that are schizoid, who don't want to have anything to do with people. People are just the problem. The narcissist, who is just so full of themselves that they think they're above everybody else, when in reality, down inside, it is the pendulum swing from the real truth, and that is that they feel very insecure. So they have to make everybody else believe that they are, the best thing since sliced bread. And if I had a way to show this to you, I would show you a Venn diagram that shows all these different forms of craziness, these 3 different forms of craziness I've been talking about, with normalcy in the middle and with these 3 types along the outer edge. That people who have these disorders, these 3 types of craziness, often appear very normal. You might not suspect it at all. They can be very, very intelligent people. Even today, I had someone telling me about a person who is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but they were so smart, they got through a PhD program. But that doesn't change the fact that they have all the symptoms in their relationships that have to do with this disorder. So when it comes to these 3 different types of craziness, the most difficult to work with typically, and the ones that cause the most family disruption, are the ones that have character disorders, okay? Personality disorders. Let me describe them, generally speaking, a little bit more. Insight tends to be very low. And what I mean by that is they don't understand how they are the common denominator in all the interpersonal struggles that they have. You would think it would sink in, but they typically don't understand how they are the cause of the problems that they experience in their interpersonal relationships. The other thing is, most of these issues stem from early childhood and the way they bonded and connected with their parents, or lack thereof. And so as a result of that, their current interpersonal relationships are highly fragile. But This is all they know. And so it is normal to them, albeit very uncomfortable for most of them. And so they don't take responsibility, nor do they understand how these patterns recapitulate over and over again. It's almost like a compulsion, a recapitulation compulsion to do the same thing eventually with every relationship. And since they don't see their part, they don't take responsibility for the problems. It's very much in contrast to somebody who has a neurosis. With a neurosis, they're going to take responsibility for not only themselves, but how everybody else feels too. A person with a neurosis is going to say, oh, I should have done this. Oh, I could have done that. Oh, I wish I'd have done this. Okay, a person with a character disorder is going to say, I had to do this. I had to do that. They don't feel like they have control, and they exert a tremendous amount of control, often at the expense of others, to try to get what they want and what they feel they need. And one of the common things that people with personality disorders will do is that they will idealize someone or something and believe that it is giving them exactly what they need. Therapists who encounter somebody with a personality disorder often initially feel very empowered by this person because they're so complimentary and so excited about getting the help they need. But it doesn't take long before this person is usually very disappointed. And as high as they have elevated that therapist or that other person in the relationship, could be a romantic situation too, that is how far they shall fall, and then some. Okay? So that is one of the key and cardinal red flags of a character disorder. Now, of all these things, these three different types, like I said, clearly the kind of crazy that we need to address the most is the character disorder. I'd like to be Paul Revere for a moment. The holidays are coming. The holidays are coming. The holidays are coming. Do you know what that means? That means that Uncle Remus, the one with the borderline personality disorder, he's going to be knocking on your door for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, or you're going to be going someplace where you are going to see him. Okay? So don't forget that. They are going to come, and you're going to. It reminds me of that old proverb. You can pick your friends. You can even pick your nose. But you can't pick your family. You remember that one? That's an oldie. What can you do then? This is the advice that I have for you tonight. Number one, don't get sucked up in the craziness. Try your best to avoid the craziness. They will bait you by provocative comments, okay? They will bring up politics and religion. They will make negative comments about your children or about the paint on the walls of your house. Don't get sucked in from the beginning. Those altercations need to be nipped in the bud by not letting it zing you as best as possible. You have to come into the situation expecting that this is going to happen. And when it does, you let it pass by, okay? In some ways, that's like heaping fiery coals on their head because they're hoping that you're going to do what you've always done, and that is jump in and start the whole process, the whole drama. But if they have a character disorder, you're not going to teach them anything, okay? You're not going to be able to somehow fix this issue and teach them not to talk that way. It's just not going to happen. It will only escalate the anger or the conflict. All you have to do is look back on previous experiences. And you can probably remember that. Number 2, set up some emotional boundaries. Set up some emotional boundaries. So people with these character disorders have a way of moving something that's a simple difference of opinion, moving from that kind of a discussion to an assault on you as a person. You might like a certain candidate to be president of the United States. They have a different opinion. Within seconds, they are attacking you as a person, and maybe even trying to put shame on you over that. So having emotional boundaries or a thick skin is needed to deal with these people, whether they're a relative or not. And when I'm with somebody who's like this, I have to ask myself over and over again, who owns the problem? Okay? Who owns the problem? They are trying to make this my problem by sucking me into this debate, into this argument, because they want me to agree with them and validate their opinion. But I don't agree. I'm going to move on to something different. And if they continue to try to come at me, well, I'm not going to play that game because this is not my problem. And likewise, if they come to your house and they praise you, praise over this and praise over that, try not to let that make you feel really good, okay? Because that is an emotional manipulation. It feels good. You want to just suck that in and say, yeah. But know that as high as they have elevated you and your choices, there's going to come a point where you have to pay the piper and it's all going to come down. Okay, so that's the other thing. Maintaining a little bit of an emotional distance so that you don't get sucked into that emotional manipulation. People with these personality disorders have a way of making you feel what they are feeling. So if they feel abandoned or neglected or anticipating something, they have a way of getting you to feel the same way. And it doesn't feel good. So keeping that emotional distance and having those boundaries is exceptionally important. Number 3, exercise lots of patience. If they're here for the holidays, do your best to keep saying to yourself, this is time limited. It won't be long, and they're going to be gone. I can be gracious right now. This behavior is not okay. I understand that this is not good. And you might have to say those same words to your family that is having to deal with this person. This behavior is not okay. But they're only going to be here for a few days. And do your best then to make it through that time without being pulled in. Now, if they become physically abusive, which potentially could happen, then it becomes a legal issue. And you do have to do something about that. You do have to stand up and make sure that, there is a clear point at which you will take action. Okay, but outside of that, try to give as much leeway as you can. I'm not saying it's okay, but I'm saying it could be worse if you let them take over. Ongoing forgiveness is the next one I have written down. Number 4, ongoing forgiveness. Somebody like this you can really start to dislike. Someone like this you could even start to say that you hate. But you know what? That only puts you into another form of bondage, doesn't it? And so we know that when Jesus was asked, how many times should I forgive? What did he say? 7 times 70. That implies that it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time deal and then, you've had your chance, you're done. It's an ongoing kind of thing. And if you're curious about that, just go to Matthew 18. And it doesn't mean that you have to be vulnerable again, okay? It doesn't mean that you have to let them walk on you again just because you forgave them. It means that you are setting yourself free, is what it means. And so it's a wonderful thing that we can identify the previous patterns and the way these people have acted, that we can expect that they're going to act the same way. They might surprise us, it's possible, okay? But there's a high probability that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And if that is the case, then they probably will act the same way. And so we need to expect that we will have to continue to forgive. The next thing I have is have hope. Maintain hope. It's not all doom and gloom. Sometimes people who are rather toxic to relationships do change. Even people who've been this way for a long, long time do change. I can't tell you how many times in my office I've had people say to me, you know, my parents are different people now compared to the way they were when I was a kid. And so they're caught in a bit of a dilemma, because if they were the same person, the same kind of people that raised them, they would have no qualms about going and confronting them and working some of the stuff that they're carrying out. But because they seem to have changed and improved, and now they may even have a close relationship, and they still are carrying the wounds of the past. And so that creates a bind. But it also means that is a good thing, because people do change in a positive direction. Maybe it just took a lot of time and a lot of maturity and life experiences, but we can have hope that that is going to happen. And it looks like the last thing I have here is to let go. To let go. Sometimes the boundaries need to be very thick. And for your own sanity, you may have to let go of the relationship. Sometimes that is the case. Now, I'm not saying that you ban them necessarily from your life, but I'm saying that in certain circumstances, if a person is really toxic to the relationship, to the family, there might be times when you have to put up those thick walls and really not allow them to have the same kind of access as everybody else. I really am not one who is in favor of families being torn apart because somebody does have a personality disorder, because people do change. But I think that you might have to continuously keep them at bay for your own protection. And that's a lot of work. And it might be very painful for a lot of people. But that pain is by your choice and not the result of being inflicted upon by somebody else. Okay? And that is something that you can live with. All right? So I think if you do decide to try your best to keep somebody at a distance, you need to make sure that you do have consultation on that you seek the Lord's will, that you pray extensively about that, and you don't do it just because you feel uncomfortable because of past arguments or something. All right. There we have it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dan Jenkins, would you join me in thanking him for his presentation? Thank you so very much. I need to add, if I may, about Dr. Dan Jenkins. I actually have the privilege of teaching part-time at the university where he is full-time as a professor. And so I hear the students talk about him, and it's in such a positive light. Some of you may have been at our most recent My Therapist Says, Dr. Julie Hayden. She's the Dean of Behavioral Sciences at Southern California Seminary, and who happened to be one of Dr. Dan Jenkins' students years ago, and she publicly said that Dr. Jenkins is and has been her favorite professor. And she went on to articulate that she said he sometimes can be so fun, and I think she used the word even corny, which university students love us when we're a little bit nerdy. I don't know if that is, but it said how one man had everything packed in him. She said, I was just mesmerized by his teaching, and here she is, a very, very strong influencer in mental health here in the county of San Diego. So that's a commendation to Dr. Jenkins. By the way, every semester, I think it is, you teach abnormal psych, I believe, and that is one of the students' favorite classes. You can imagine, because Dr. Jenkins has all of these situations that he has seen over these many years in his clinical office, not necessarily university students, but in his clinical office, and is able to help them to see some of these real life situations. So thank you. I don't know that I've heard it so succinctly and so helpfully stated, because I took notes, and those 6 items of what we can do, I think we're going to dive into those. And by the way, we do have several questions, and for those who are listening live stream, you're probably aware with the brochure that was sent out to over 7,000 people that you're able to actually text a question directly to me. I have my phone here, and that number is listed on the brochure that you received. So those of you here present, you're sending some questions up front here. I'd like to, if we can, begin with one of the very first questions that I had here. And this question, again, the rest of this evening is run by your questions, is my kid's mom is a drug addict, and talked about legal drugs. She has a victim mentality. Is she crazy? I think that this would be a very common question that I've seen in my own practice. My kid's mom is a drug addict, legal drugs. She has a victim mentality. Is she crazy? How would you respond to that? That's kind of a very open question. We can dialogue about it, but I think it's a helpful question to begin with here this evening.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that she does have a bona fide diagnosis of being a drug abuser. Now, that doesn't mean automatically that she qualifies for the term crazy, but she does have a DSM diagnosis that we can point to immediately. But why does she use drugs? Okay, that's a very good question to ask. Is it because she carries within her wounds from the past that she is trying to numb and to run from by using drugs? And it could very well be that she is a victim, but instead of taking responsibility for her life right now, it's easier to avoid facing those things and turning to something that will make her feel good right now, rather than doing the hard work. And so those problems don't get resolved. So I would say there is a form of craziness in all addictions.
So there's a sense, you talked earlier, Dr. Jenkins, about how some of these craziness behaviors may originate with parenting that was not healthy, that was not helpful. So in a way, maybe that child was not able to learn how to tolerate anxiety, or something like a test is coming up and it causes a bit of anxiety, or a friendship is not working out and that causes a bit of anxiety. And for whatever reason, the person may not be able to tolerate that anxiety, and they will go to kind of a self-medicating versus self-regulating behavior. Is that what you're referring to? And how the addictive piece in a person's life could be a bit crazy. We're using that term pretty generally here, pretty loosely. But is that what you're referring to? What do we do with a person that maybe never really learned how to tolerate a level of anxiety? Like, for example, you may have arisen this morning and you had something challenging at work or at school or in a relationship. And you got up and you thought about it, you prayed about it, you even asked God to give you insight into it, and you were tolerating this anxiety of what you might be facing today. And that's a level of health. So the ability to tolerate some level of anxiety is more on the health end. We're talking about those who may not be able to tolerate normal anxiety or pressures or situations in life that can overwhelm us. Is that correct? So go right ahead.
Yeah, there's no doubt that some people have very, very difficult times tolerating the anxiety of life.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if they've been using some kind of substance in order to avoid feeling that anxiety. When the substance is taken away, which is part of the process of trying to get a person back to health, they feel overwhelmed. Not only do you have the after effects of and the withdrawal symptoms of the substance, but then you have the tremendous realization of what it was that you are running from. Let me jump back real quick to the family situation I was describing earlier, just this last weekend. You will never meet these people, so I feel like I can share a little bit about them. The brother who is struggling with all the anxiety and the psychotic features that are associated with that was told by his other brother that he was molested as a child by this other brother. He had no memory of that. But it explains why he's never been able to stay in a relationship very long. It helps to explain why he turns to alcohol and drugs to try to feel better. It helps to explain why, now that he is a year sober from the alcohol and over a year sober from the methamphetamine, he's now starting to get healthy, and then all of a sudden, he's flooded by all this emotion. You sometimes have to get crazy, go crazy, on the pathway to mental health. I know that sounds weird. It goes along with the old saying that sometimes you get worse before you get better, because you are taking out those things that you have been running from, placing them on the table, and now looking at them. And it's very, very painful. And that's part of what he's going through right now. So yeah, it's due oftentimes to earlier events in life and the things that have happened to us in childhood. None of us have escaped childhood unscathed. We all carry with us wounds. And so that affects our character, that affects how we deal with things and the desire to avoid. It affects whether we take responsibility for our own actions or expect other people to take responsibility for us. All those things we learn.
So in essence, I think I'm hearing you suggest that those that might be behaving in ways that feel abnormal, they don't feel normal, so kind of crazy. I'm not sure that's the best term. I did use that in the title of tonight's presentation. But out of the normal range, they may be a person who is not able to embrace pain. So for example, if you had a very poor day at work, and maybe somebody was in a way cruel verbally, there would be some different feelings that a person would experience. I might feel sad, I might feel angry, I might feel a bit frustrated, and I may need to actually decompress, or if you want to say express or lay it out on the table, maybe my sadness, I might cry. I learned to cry in my 30s, and I'm so thankful that I can do that much better than I did in my earlier years of life. And so being able to embrace the pain and almost kind of exercise it out, sort of like getting up this morning. I ran, and in my exercise, the running, getting some of the toxins out of my system, that emotionally we do a similar piece. But if we have not done that or built a skill in doing this, I think that's why you were listing these 7. 7. Even number 4, which was ongoing forgiveness, that is exercising a process that I'm going to turn toward this person and engage them rather than turn away from them.
That's right.
Is that right? So
that's absolutely correct. When we find ourselves avoiding,
because you said that a moment ago, yes,
then that's fallen into the spectrum of neurosis.
Yes.
So a person, just about everything that's listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a neurosis, with the exception of what they call the psychotic disorders, whether it be depression, anxiety disorders, all kinds of impulse disorders or addictions. They all seem to be about protecting ourselves and avoiding something that we are afraid of, or something that's going to remind us of something else. And so we cope by using these different methods. And it doesn't solve it. These ways of coping that we learned usually from our parents do not solve the problem. Oh, and I might add real quick, if you have parents who are personality disordered, or even one who is, let's say, a narcissist, you're more likely to have a neurosis as a child, because you're always having to try to figure out what they are wanting from you and what they are feeling, and you are taking care of them. You're doing what they ask you to do, because if you don't, horrible things happen. And so that's an interesting way that this perpetuates itself. It kind of jumps a generation, you might say, from character disorder to a neurosis to back to somebody who's a character disorder.
Okay, because you were talking about, again, the psychotic is the psychosis, the neurotic is the neurosis, the personality disorder, that would be the character craziness that you're referring to. So the neurotic, what happens if you have that narcissistic parent? And that, in other words, you were talking, Dr. Jenkins, about the narcissistic personality disorder has a lot of insecurity, and I think you helped us to understand that earlier. And in that insecurity, the person would then project what would look like they're perfect, they have it all together, they have high control over others, say you and your other family members. But what is happening, the child that grows up under that has now a lot of anxiety because the child, and this speaks to a lot of us. So the child then, you were saying, has to take care of the parent. It's inverted. So it's kind of this inversion of parenting. We call it a bit of parentification, where the child becomes the parent. It's inverted. And so the child grows up with quite a bit of anxiety. And the anxiety is, I don't know what's going to happen with my parent next, but I'm supposed to help make it okay. Does that ring true for some of us? That some people grow up under this, and therefore, you said earlier in your presentation, they then take too much responsibility for others. That's the bit of neurosis. Like, I'm afraid what others said, or did I say it the wrong way? Even though it's good to ask if we hurt someone and to take responsibility, but it's when I really overfunction with it. I go overboard with it, like, I wonder if that's going to be okay. So my worrisome becomes anxiety. Is that what you were saying?
Absolutely. And the same thing is true, I might add, for parents who are alcoholics, and then the child being raised in an environment, they become adult children of alcoholics. You've maybe heard of ACA groups because of the commonality. They walk into a room and they immediately sense what everybody's feeling, because that's how they had to figure out what was going on at home. If their dad was going to rage, or if they were going to be upset just because you spilled a little milk, that kind of sensitivity and that taking responsibility for other people is a form of craziness, because it burns people out. They cannot function very well for very long when they're taking responsibility for so many other people in their lives.
Okay, this is excellent. This is right, really, where the rubber meets the road, in a sense. Let's talk for just a moment about that. So say I have that experience, the experience you just described, because we're focusing on the neurotic. And then the neurotic or the neurosis, maybe family member, can create you said anxiety, avoidance, they're nervous, they may have high insecurities, and then it may cause them to feel responsible for others' feelings. This is this antenna you're referring to. So they're like overly sensitive what's going on because they didn't know if the spilled milk I would get hit or sent to my room for making a clumsy error. I mean, I'm still clumsy, but I was much more clumsy as a kid. So what does a person do? Say someone is listening here in our audience, or they're live streaming or listening to this after the presentation, And say I have some of those feelings. Maybe I overfunction. So maybe I am the crazy person going into my family Thanksgiving, and like I'm going to be overly sensitive, and so I'm already burned out by the time I get to the family function. What are some things that I can do? I know you gave us 6 incredible steps for dealing with that person or persons. What are some steps that we can take if as we're discussing this, you're feeling that? You're feeling what you just described.
I think one of the things that we have to do is recognize that other people don't care as much as we think they do. You may think that if I don't bring that potato salad, everybody is going to be mad at me, and they are going to just walk out on Thanksgiving because I didn't do what I normally do. And you're anticipating horrible things happening because of something that you didn't do or won't do, and it's going to be a catastrophe. Okay, that is taking too much responsibility for other people's feelings, and they don't care. They really don't care as much as we think they do. When we're neurotic, we're making a mountain out of a molehill typically. When you're character disordered, you're standing on the mountain and you don't even see it. Okay? So, yeah, that's
that's a really good point. So one way might just be to realize that people are not thinking about us as often as we might think they are.
That's right.
Okay? And then also maybe take a deep breath and be able to focus on what you're thinking. When we're a little bit anxiety, some of our students who have anxiety, they're not able to, when they get a little bit of anxiety, they can't stay present. So they're having to worry about other things. So sometimes we'll have a place, Bond Hall, where they can go and take a test, where it's quiet, they're not having to be their antennas are not triggered, if you will, and so they're able to settle down. So breathing a bit, and then also realizing, and maybe even whisper a wonderful psalm that the Lord has provided. I just know even the 23rd Psalm, when I say that to myself, I begin to settle down and realize that God's in charge, and I don't need to be in charge. I don't need to be so concerned about things. So that's more of the neurosis where the person's too responsible. Now, when you talked about the character craziness or the character personality disorder, they really, they're concerned less. They're concerned less about us, right?
That's yeah, they don't really care too much about what other people think.
Right.
Typically. And there's lots of different types of character disorders. But the ultimate character disorder that doesn't care about what other people think is the antisocial personality. They would just as soon rob you of your watch than to ask what time of day it is. Okay, so they don't care too much about what other people think. And the thing about these personality disorders is that they're all overlapping. We identify different types and put them into categories, but really they all kind of weave together in a big old mush. It's for our simplistic minds that we try to categorize them. And you'll find that there are people who have lots of different components of each of the different types of personality disorders.
And isn't one of the themes, and I do have a question that actually came on my phone that I'll get to in just a moment, is that one of the themes is that the person has a tendency to have low self-empathy. So they're not able to extend that necessarily to others. Is that...
Yes, that's correct. In fact, one of the things about antisocial personality disorder is that you don't want to give them therapy, which sounds counterproductive.
Right.
The reason is you'll teach them how to look empathic, you will teach them how to seem to care.
Like they're acting it out.
And they are really acting in order to manipulate people.
Yes.
Okay? So that's one of the challenges. The best treatment for antisocial personality disorder apparently is putting them, this sounds terrible, but waiting until their testosterone levels drop to a certain point, letting them get old. And so they say that one of the best treatments is actually putting them in jail. And the thing is, they end up going there. That's where most of them end up going, either that or they become the top executives of Enron or some other big corporation, and J.R. Ewing, does that ring a bell to anybody?
Yeah, there's stats on that. Isn't it like 6% of CEOs? There's some stats that will show that there is a higher number than we'd like to be. That's why you said in number 1, don't get sucked up in the craziness, because what's happening in this is that you would be manipulated. You're not thinking about manipulating the other person. However, they may be manipulating you because there's low self-esteem. That's why early on in childhood, when teachers will do this often. They'll look into the eyes of that child and they'll listen to the child, and as they're listening to the child has value. And when the child has value, they feel like they have a voice. If they feel like they have a voice, then they have self-empathy that's developing. It's a wonderful gift. You know, when you think about it, if you're in an airplane, the person that comes by and you have a little child, they'll say, "Sir or ma'am, remember to put the mask on yourself first before you put it on the child." Well, if we don't have self-empathy, it's difficult to give empathy. And so that empathy is really what God gives to us, if we really understood how much He loves us. But you did say, number 1, don't get sucked up in the craziness, the negative comments about your children, but let it pass. So sometimes it's difficult to let it pass because we want to correct it and say, no, I really didn't say that. I really was trying to say this. Now that could be they're manipulating, the antisocial, I know particularly, but this lack of empathy, that's not normal. That's abnormal. That's why you teach the class, right? It's abnormal psych. It's not what a normal person would respond to. Okay, here's another question, and I want to go to this question. How do you deal with the person who tries to get others in your group, and this does happen? How do you deal with the person who tries to get others in your group of friends to turn against you because that person has had a disagreement with you? And then it goes on, the person asks, these people are afraid that person will turn against them if they don't comply with their request. So somehow they're manipulated by this person, and they're trying to manipulate this person against you. This is called triangulation, of course, in a way. This is very common, so it's a powerful question, I think. What do we do with that? Very good question.
Well, the thing about any form of manipulation is that you need to be able to take it out and put it on the table and let it see the light of day, okay? So somebody is working behind the scenes to try to get other people to reject you or dislike you or to not associate with you. That needs to be brought out. That needs to be put out there, and getting the whole group together. Now, if you're talking about a family system, doing family therapy or getting them together and talking it out, usually with a mediator, it's a really good idea to have somebody who's kind of like in charge, who's going to be able to keep things from getting out of control. But trying to go to each person individually sounds like a solution, but you've got somebody else working against you as fast as you're probably working to try to pull things together. Really, the thing to do is to get everybody together in the same room, if it's possible, and work out this issue.
So are you suggesting, is it Matthew 18, where, if you have an ought against your brother, first go and be reconciled? When we're dealing with abnormal people, if you will, in this, that may not work, even though that's biblically sound. Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
We're not countering the Bible.
You might want to go to them first, as is the biblical mandate in Matthew 18. So I think that is not a bad idea, to go to that person who's doing the manipulating. But if they are manipulating other people, do you think they'd be more likely to have traits of being a personality disorder or traits of a neurosis? Mm-hmm. Somebody with a neurosis, probably the traits of a personality disorder. Are they going to care that you are trying to get them to stop manipulating other people away from you? Probably not.
Yeah, that's the assumption. We assume that they're going to care, and that causes us to want to make it right. They're not thinking the same way.
No.
They're not feeling the same way. They're not emoting.
Or they may have already decided that you are done. You have gone too far, and I'm going to turn these people against you. You come to them, they know it's working. So, it very well could be that that's not going to work. But if it's somebody that is open to hearing you out and understanding the situation, I think it's important to go to them first and try. And if that doesn't work, then get everybody together and try to resolve it. The typical thing that happens with people who have personality disorders is that whatever they try to do to manipulate others usually backfires on them. Okay? It usually comes back on them.
Thank you. Let me go to this. I had a question here that I think was really, really powerful, if I may. That the question here is, hi, Don. I have a brother-in-law who's 62 years old. This was a texted question. Hi, Don. I have a brother-in-law who is 62 years old and claims to be a Christian who never stops talking about how bad his life is, and recently revealed that he was abused as a child by his father. This rings a bit of your family member to a degree here, of course, totally different situation. No matter what I say to encourage him, he just continues the same theme. How would you suggest we deal with this? So here's the question. I have a brother-in-law who's 62 years old and claims to be a Christian who never stops talking about how bad his life is, and recently revealed that he was abused as a child by his father. No matter what I say to encourage him, he just continues the same theme. How would you suggest we deal with this? Wow.
Well, I think the first thing is he needs a listening ear. He needs somebody to hear him talk about this. And I think that the expectation needs to be that he's going to need to talk about this for a period of time. And that's where the patience comes in. It may seem like he's just playing the victim, and maybe he is. But I would rather err on the side of letting a person talk about this new discovery that they were molested, or if it's not new, to give them an audience to share that and to work through it. And then imagine yourself just kind of walking beside them through this process, showing them a lot of acceptance. If they're trying to get something from you, if they're trying to manipulate you to give them money because they've had a rough life, then you might start to question and need to put up some boundaries there. But if they're talking about things that really truly hurt them, it sounds more like a neurosis to me, and it sounds like this person could use your support. So I know it's difficult to go from just a brief question to providing a solid answer in how to deal with it, but that is my first thought about it.
Very helpful. I really appreciate, this is a delight this evening, and I so appreciate your knowledge and expertise. I really do, Dr. Jenkins. Another statement that came in online, and I'm going to go into another question that came here tonight, but this question is from someone from their phone, texting in. I have a narcissistic mother, and now I understand why I always had to try and, quote, make everyone happy, unquote, or always be the one to take care of things, leading to a lot of anxiety. So it sounds like the work we're doing here this evening, and you are working, this kind of thinking with cognition and affect, that's your emotion, doing that work together is some of the most difficult work any of us can ever do, and perhaps the most rewarding. That's your thinking and how you feel about it. Being able to balance those two. So this person really said, I have a narcissistic mother, and now I understand why I always had to try and make everyone happy, or always be the one to take care of things, leading to a lot of anxiety. So this person's realizing that she or he may need to deal with some of this anxiety that you're experiencing. This question here, as we have just about 10 more minutes, we're winding down. This question goes back to some of what you gave to us a little earlier. Is there a fine line between not getting sucked in and setting boundaries? So the person is asking, what's the difference here between not getting sucked in and setting boundaries, and what is the difference between avoiding and letting go? Shall we start with the first? For the first one, it's a two-pronged question. I think a very fair question as I look at my notes from your presentation, Dr. Jenkins. Is there a fine line between not getting sucked in, which is what we spoke about and discussed quite a bit, and then setting boundaries?
Yeah, I think that not getting sucked in is a form of setting a boundary. It's an emotional boundary. you're letting yourself, you can't control what they say. So they may say something that is highly offensive to try to get a reaction out of you. They truly don't necessarily care that it's offensive to you. They're trying to get you to go into the drama that typically happens maybe every Christmas or whatever. And so you're using this technique of pulling back and just not responding as a form of disengagement and setting a boundary, because even though it hurts you at that level, if you engage, it's going to hurt you at a much higher level. Does that make sense? That if you get hurt by the comment about how ugly the walls look and the color of the paint, but just think how badly you're going to hurt if your mother or whoever this is starts, because you commented on, well, it's the same color that you have in your living room, then she starts to get really upset, and pretty soon it escalates out of control and she storms out or you storm out. The pain associated with that is so much greater. It's better to nip it in the bud and stop it when it's small than to let it get out of hand and then become a much larger thing. So the avoidance is a form of emotional boundary setting.
So you use the word let it pass by. You said that earlier in your presentation. Let's get real practical. That was very practical. Let's take it laser focused down to even a further. So say I'm critiquing you. Could you say, may we just act this out for just a moment? Sure. Say we'll use what you were saying. Dan, we've been brothers all these years, and we're coming to your house, and I kind of don't like the color of your walls here in this living room. I just want to let you know that.
Yeah, these colors may not be the prettiest, but they're what we're living with right now, and we kind of like them. Well,
I just want to let you know I really don't. I really want you to know that. I've been thinking about that for quite some time, and I just kind of want to remind you of the colors are just drab. We would never put these kind of colors in our house.
Well, thank you so much for that feedback. I really appreciate that feedback. Thank you.
Okay.
That may be too just disingenuous, but I could say thank you, I suppose.
Okay. So what you're doing is your inflection went down. And if you'll notice that Dr. Jenkins turned away from me. So in letting it pass by, you're disengaging, I'm assuming, from the conversation. Because what you're having to do, if I'm assuming, is you didn't like what I said, as your brother. And you have to then manage your own emotional response.
Right.
And then have a choice of what you're going to do. And he actually turned away from me. So I'd have to kind of keep following him. But I meant this wall over here, and you're going into the living room or in the kitchen or someplace else. And would you continue to give eye contact, or would you keep moving away?
I think moving away, if it's somebody that has a tendency of provoking arguments and negative feedback and is trying to manipulate to get the drama going, I think avoidance is probably one of the best things to do. If we're dealing with somebody who's relatively healthy and they made a comment like that, you might come right out and say, well, that's a painful thing to be told. That doesn't feel very good. I really feel badly that you don't like these walls, but someday we'll think about coloring them a different color. But right now, that doesn't feel too good. That would be maybe some feedback that you could give a healthy person. But somebody who has a character disorder isn't going to care so much about that. They're just going to want to create drama. And so you might have to do some distraction. You might have to, say, let's talk about something different, and just launch into something immediately different to avoid it getting out of control.
Yeah. And so the second way you functioned was, if I were more of a healthy person, you would actually share how the statement impacted me. So how my statement impacted you, you would say that, what you just said, Don. So I'm kind of talking to myself. That doesn't feel very good. So you're becoming vulnerable to me, and hopefully, since I have normal empathy, I would go, ooh, I didn't mean to hurt my brother here.
Right.
Apparently I did, and I might begin to back up because you made yourself vulnerable. With a character disorder or with someone with the other neurotic or neurosis issues the craziness we're talking about, you do not make yourself vulnerable. That's the key.
Especially with a character disorder.
Yes.
With a neurotic person, they're probably not going to say something so blatantly harmful.
Right.
They're probably going to
Indirect.
be worried about your feelings and think that they have maybe offended you when in fact they haven't. But with a character disorder, which 10%, you're going to run across people with that. They're going to be saying horrible things without a whole lot of care about how it comes out.
And the reason I didn't mean to interrupt. The reason we begin to feel uncomfortable is because there's a level of manipulation. It's almost like they're taking your emotion to feel good about themselves. Does that make sense? So if I'm saying to you, I don't really like the colors, and you become emotional toward me, like, wow, that, then I'm feeling good because guess what? I'm in control, or a pseudo sense of control, because I'm actually destroying the relationship, and yet it feels like I'm taking emotion from you. This is what can happen.
Exactly.
We have run out of time, and I so appreciate Dr. Jenkins. Whenever I can get him to come back here, I do, and he has been so willing over the years. As you can see, he's not only very well versed as a clinical psychologist in these areas, very astute, yet he has a strong biblical background, and he actually applies that. And I just love hearing that combination. That's a rarity in the psychological movement, to see someone who's skilled in both areas. So I deeply appreciate that. And would you join me in thanking Dr. Dan Jenkins for being with us this evening?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. And I would like to mention that our next My Therapist Says is, and you'll be able to see that on the screen, is Dr. Joe Price. Dr. Joe Price is an outstanding communicator. He's a professor at San Diego State University. He has his PhD in child development and works diligently in research. And his wife happens to be a pastor on staff here at Skyline Church. And he's a marvelous thinker, and I hope that you will look how to persevere, when you want to give up. How to persevere when you want to give up. My wife and I have actually invited Dr. Price and his wife to dinner so they could advise us how to be better parents. I so highly admire him, and they've done that on occasion. And I still remember one thing that he said to us, and that is to be a predictable parent. I've thought about that statement. Predictability means there's going to be low anxiety in the children. And I've thought about that, and he's a man full of wisdom. So I hope that you will invite others to participate, how to persevere when you want to give up. And that is coming up December 1st at 6:45 here in this auditorium. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and if you don't mind, I will close us out with a word of prayer, and I trust that you will drive safely in the rain this evening. I know it's wet out there, and we'll have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the ability to combine biblical truth with scientific research. We want to honor you that anything that we discover, we know there's truth in the Bible where it originates. And so we thank you for that, because when we look into the Bible, we look into the heart of God. And when we look into the heart of God, we have lower anxiety, we have higher trust, we have better and more healthy relationships because of knowing you. We want to recognize, Father, that you are God and we don't know your full mind. We do know your full heart because you poured it out and continue to do so through Christ. And we thank you, you speak to us through the wonderful voice and comforter of the Holy Spirit. So thank you for this evening. Thank you for your presence. And we didn't get to all the questions, yet you know all of them, and you're going with us now as we leave this auditorium. For those listening long distance, we pray you would bless them this evening. May they sense your presence that makes all the difference in each of our lives. We're so grateful that we know you, and if there's someone that was listening in who does not know you this evening, that they could turn to you this evening and just simply say, Father, I realize that I'm a sinner and I'm in need of you. Would you please forgive my sins and come into my life? You've promised you would do that. It's a wonderful gift, a wonderful presence, a wonderful life. with you leading it. So we praise you this evening, and we give you praise once again for who you are and whose we are in and through Christ Jesus. And in his precious name, the precious name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.